Greetings, this is Griff Ruby with part 42 of my series, Ecclesiology for Sedevacantists, based on Dogmatic Theology, Volume 2 by Msgr G. Van Noort. We're going to continue directly where we left off, now page 129, Scholion 1. The diversity of liturgies and of disciplinary laws. The diversity of rites in different parts of the Church does not break up the required unity of communion. This variety does not affect the substance of Christian worship, i.e., those rites which Christ personally determined, but only the external ceremonies instituted by the Church. Ceremonies are simply declarations of faith that are expressed in deeds rather than in words. Therefore, as long as the same faith is expressed by these different ceremonies, and the necessary submission to legitimate pastors is observed, the communion is not sundered. It is the same with disciplinary laws, i.e., particular regulations by which the divinely established laws of right living are applied in different ways and given specific determination to correspond to varying circumstances of times, locales, and persons. Now, this does not, of course, extend anywhere near so far to the Novus Ordo, which really does enshrine a whole different religion by its systematic removal of a number of basic Catholic doctrines, by even its occasional affirmation of various heretical principles from time to time. Like, for example, the first of the fourth Eucharistic prayer actually describes the Father alone as being God, total Arianism. Things like that just create, they're part of the Novus Ordo, beliefs. So those are the kinds of things that show, you see, and then more importantly, of course, the Novus Ordo doesn't have its origin in authentic Catholic authority. It just doesn't. So that said, it has its roots, in fact, in Protestant services that have already been condemned. So it's like when one does the same thing as the Protestants, one is saying they are a Protestant. They're putting the name on themselves. You see. Scholion 2. The opinion of some Anglicans. Some Anglicans, Pusey, Palmer, and others, pervert completely the genuine notion of the Church by admitting that unity of communion is indeed desirable but not absolutely necessary, by claiming that the true Church of Christ actually comprises three distinct communions, Roman, Greek, and Anglican, which should be joined in an amicable association without destroying their individual independence. Whatever they are in fact, these three societies most certainly do not form one fold, one body, and even should such an association be effected, they would still remain simply several churches. That is clear from the case of nations, which, although they often enter into mutual alliances, still remain several distinct nations. And Gladstone's position is hardly tenable, namely that Christ did at the beginning will the unity of the Church, but that now that circumstances have changed, he no longer requires it. It's always required. Of course it's required. It can fail to exist in certain points in history. It has. First great Western Schism, of course, was when you had two and then three different communions within the Church. I think sometimes when certain Catholics today have allowed schismatic attitudes to infiltrate their minds, you kind of get the same thing again today. But this is just Catholics being bad Catholics, very bad Catholics, as I pointed out in the last section, who probably should question whether they are still in the Church. But the fact of the matter is, you see, Christ doesn't want simply some confederation of churches. He wants a church with one leader. That's how he set it up. That's how he created it. And they're saying, oh, no, it's okay to just stay this way. No, it's not. We may have to, as a practical step of working our way towards rebuilding the church from the smithereens that's left after that huge shepherd being struck scenario with Vatican II, maybe temporarily pass through such a phase. But by the very nature of the thing, it is meant to be temporary and extremely short-lived, because it is a progression from there directly to full and proper unification under a single leader, i.e. successor of Peter. You see, whereas these guys are, well, things falling apart, and I guess Christ thinks that's okay now, so that's enough, and we're just content to go that way indefinitely. Well, that's a great way to, I guess, a live and let die kind of situation, or die and let die, but that's not, that's not the ways of God's church. Proposition: Christ willed that his church enjoy unity of rule, hierarchical unity, which consists in this, that all the members of the church obey one and the same visible authority. This authority rests in the Catholic episcopate with the Roman pontiff at its head, yet in such wise that it is found full and entire in the latter all by himself, the latter being the head. That Christ so built his church as to make it necessarily one in oneness of rule is proved by what has already been said about the institution by Christ of the hierarchy and of the primacy, and about their permanent continuity. The Vatican Council called the Supreme Pontiff the principle and foundation of unity, because by his influence he establishes and preserves unity. Leo XIII called him the principle and focal point of unity, especially because all faithful and bishops alike must look up to him and stand faithfully by him. This latter description expresses the relationship of the Church to the Pope, of the former, the relationship of the Pope to the Church. So I find that kind of helpful too. I mean, but how do we apply that now? Well, obviously, even without a pope, there have been enough popes over history to tell us a great deal of detail exactly what it is that the church believes. They've nailed down a great deal. And one thing that traditional Catholics, one and all, do necessarily and by definition do is adhere to the entirety of it. If you don't, then you're not really a traditional Catholic, even if you might happen to enjoy the Latin Mass, if you don't adhere to the whole of what has been taught by the popes. So, yeah, and that's also why one of the reasons why they've rejected so many of the more recent claimants in the Vatican, as far as obviously not being popes, is because they flout what has been infallibly nailed down by the church. So, that certainly evidences that they didn't have that kind of authority. See, that's the kind of people that have come up with the Novus Ordo and so ceremonies and so forth. So anyway, Scholium, the Western Schism. It might seem that unity of rule suffered a setback in the Church at the time of the Western Schism, when for 40 years 2 or 3 men claimed to be sovereign pontiff. But with the preservation of unity of faith and communion, hierarchical unity was only materially, not formally, interrupted. I think we can safely say that hierarchical unity is, once again, materially interrupted, though it is not formally interrupted. Although Catholics were split 3 ways in their allegiance because of the doubt as to which of the contenders had been legitimately elected, they still all were agreed in believing that allegiance was owed the one legitimate successor of Peter, and they stood willing to give that allegiance. Consequently, those who, through no fault of their own, gave their allegiance to an illegitimate pope would no more be schismatics than a person would be a heretic who, desirous of following the preaching of the church, would admit a false doctrine because he was under the impression that it was taught by the church. So that's very important. Again, that describes us. We know that a real pope come along, that we would of course stand behind him and give him that allegiance. Would we not? Of course we would. That's really not even a question. Corollary: several popular catechisms and quite a few theologians speak of a unity of worship, or liturgical unity, in addition to unity of faith and rule and communion, in line with which all share in the same sacraments. This unity does of course obtain and is absolutely necessary to the extent that the worship was determined by Christ himself. However, liturgical unity is already included in the other unities. Unity of faith, since faith includes also the revealed doctrines on the sacrifice of the Mass and the sacraments, and unity of communion, since this involves the sharing in the same spiritual benefits. This is perhaps the reason that neither the Vatican Council nor Leo XIII in his encyclical on the unity of the Church makes any specific mention of liturgical unity. Well, that's it. There is a diversity of rites within the church, and that's always been so. And for myself, I've always kind of compared the variety of different rites, Eastern and Western, and certain other particular ones like the Sarum rite in England, the Gallican rite that existed before Gallicanism kind of made that, but they put a shadow over that, or even like a particular orders like Dominican rite and so forth. And these different rites are kind of like the same fact that right in the Bible you have different gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all present the story of Christ in somewhat different ways, but clearly it's the same one story, just presented with different things being emphasized. And that's how it is with the differing liturgies of the church. These things were all literally from the days of the apostles themselves. And so they're not just something invented later or concocted or cooked up along the way. They were established by the apostles. And so they have that apostolic flavor to them that nothing cooked up later on could ever have. So that's another kind of difference. But anyway, I'm going to fold up here for part